Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello.
So my name is Timka Lockhart, and I'm a second-year MBA student and a TA for Professor Creary's class, Leading Diversity in Organizations. Welcome to Leading Diversity at Wharton Speaker Series. Quick introduction. Our moderator, Stephanie Creary, is an assistant professor of management here at the Wharton School. Professor Creary is an identity and diversity scholar, and her research focuses on how workers learn from their differences and reveals how they engage in their multiple identities in an enhancing way to cultivate positive identities and improve the quality of their relationships across differences. Currently, Professor Creary teaches a course she recently developed, Leading Diversity in Organizations, to Wharton undergraduate and MBA students, and is a visionary behind the Leading Diversity at Wharton Speaker Series. Now to our featured guest, Dr. Rohini Anand. Our featured guest, Dr. Rohini Anand, is a Global Senior Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Global Chief Diversity Officer for Sodexo. She is responsible for the strategic direction, implementation, and alignment of Sodexo's integrated global diversity and inclusion initiatives, as well as Sodexo's corporate social responsibility and wellness strategies. Operating in 72 countries, Sodexo's 460,000 employees serve 100 million customers each day throughout on-site services, benefits and rewards services, and personal and home services. Under Dr. Rohini's leadership, Sodexo received the prestigious 2012 Catalyst Award and ranked in the top 10 of Diversity Inc.'s top 50 companies for diversity for 9 consecutive years. In 2018, Sodexo was also one of the first companies to be named to Diversity Inc.'s inaugural Top 50 Hall of Fame. Today, the Sodexo brand is synonymous with diversity, sustainability, and wellness leadership. In fact, Sodexo's remarkable global culture change, led by diversity and inclusion, is featured in a Harvard Business School case study entitled Shifting the Diversity Climate, the Sodexo Solution. It's a case many of us here have read. It's no wonder Dr. Rohini is widely considered a leading expert on organizational change in diversity and inclusion. We are lucky to have her here with us today. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Stephanie Creary and Dr. Rohini Anand.
Hello, hello. So nice to see you all. I see your flights made it. So welcome back. I hope you had a great break. Before we get started, just a few administrative items. I wanted to thank, again, as I always do, Professor Dean Jeff Garrett for his support of this Leading Diversity at Wharton Speaker Series. We would not have this without his leadership, so thanks to Dean Garrett, who was here for the last Speaker Series. I also want to welcome back, and she was not prepared for me to do this, Natalie Edwards, who's Global Director of Inclusion and Diversity at Estee Lauder and a grad of the Wharton MBA program. So she's come all the way from New York to spend time with us here this evening and to meet Rohini. I have to tell you, Rohini, as I've recently learned, it's like Oprah. You just say Rohini.
Right.
Rohini is quite famous. So when people heard via LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever we'd posted it, that Rohini was coming, several people from the community, the D&I community, wanted to be here. So it's quite a treat to have you here. A couple of administrative items for anybody here who has been at one of these. This is their first time at the speaker series. Just a couple of people. All right, anybody here not in my class? All right, so a couple of people aren't in my class. I know, I'm looking around. I don't recognize everybody's faces here. But this is a hybrid event, right? So this is partly an academic course for many of you. You're required to be here, and others of you just decided that you wanted to come learn more. We have a couple of ground rules that we use in my class, and so we decided to share our norms with those guests who come and participate in our environment. You know, we really pride ourselves on cultivating an inclusive learn environment that allows us to engage respectfully with others. And what we mean by that is We try to meet people where they are. We try to respectfully disagree. But it also means that we welcome minority voices and minority opinions, certainly because so many of us who take my class have had that minority voice and opinion. So where would we be if that wasn't something that we valued? So listening actively and being constructive is something that we pride ourselves on. But ultimately, we hope to achieve a community where we feel like we can be brave, not just safe, talk about the issues, learn, but also participate in dialogue that we hope moves us all forward. So with that said, I'd like to officially welcome Rohini. This is such a pleasure for me. Many of you have heard me talk about this, but I first met Rohini in 2008. It was long before there was a Harvard Business School case study on Sodexo, but there was an idea. And that idea was, we were just trying to understand, David Thomas and I, David Thomas, who's now president of Morehouse College, what a difference 11 years makes, right? So David and I had this idea to try to understand what global companies like Sodexo were doing as they started using this language that we really didn't understand. And the language that we didn't understand was global diversity strategy. And we're like, what the heck does that mean, right? And so we set out to interview a number of executives, 14 is what our number ended up being initially, who were leading diversity in their organizations, big Fortune 500 companies, your peers, many who have since retired from the practice, to begin to understand was, what's a global diversity strategy and how is that different from what you all had been doing for many years, right? So that was the burning question. And I was so taken by the work that Rohini had been doing and the stories that I learned from her. You know, our first interview was September 16th, 2008. I went back and I looked at it. Oh no, I went back and I looked at it. And it was interesting because I think the first question, and I'm going to ask you this to get us started, is, what is a global diversity strategy, and how does that differ from how we have typically characterized diversity in the North American context? Yes.
Great. So, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted that you're here despite the weather, and it's wonderful to be on campus. I was just sharing with Professor Creary that it's great to be in this environment, and I had a great conversation with many of you MBA students, so lots of questions, and I ask that you continue those questions today because I know there was some terrific discussion. So what is a global diversity strategy and how does it differ? So I mean, I think I'll answer it a couple of different ways. One is, you know, for the longest time, I sort of thought that we had a bifurcated strategy because we started this work in North America. And in North America, it was pretty clear what we wanted to accomplish. You know, we wanted to really advance underrepresented groups. So it was women, people of color, LGBT, people with disabilities, and create an inclusive environment. And we had clear metrics and, you know, just very clear outcomes that we were trying to achieve, whether it was representation of these groups or an inclusive culture where we knew everyone would engage through metrics like our inclusion surveys, et cetera. Globally, we struggled because a lot of this work cannot be translated globally. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So Sodexo is a French company. And in many parts of Europe, you are not allowed to gather data on underrepresented populations. So for legal reasons, you cannot count people by race, by ethnicity, by disability, by LGBT, et cetera. So how do you put in place, so the only thing we could really sort of measure was gender. So how do you put in place a strategy where you're not able to really, you know, sort of quantify some of these outcomes that we're looking for? So we actually started with gender. We did start with, you know, representation of women at all levels in the organization, retention of women, engagement of women. So that was a big part of our strategy. But when you talk about inclusion, you also have to look at all of the other populations. And what we had to do in that case was so we have, you know, currently we have sort of these 5 strands. So we do look at our LGBT employees globally, and we have a global LGBT network with employee networks under it. And the strategy differs depending on the country that you're in, based on the laws and regulations of those countries. We also have a global framework, and we call it a Disability Voice Task Force, where we have allies of people with disabilities in the different countries, some places where there are legal requirements, other places where we know we want to advance the recruiting and engagement of people with disabilities. And again, that differs country by country. So in Brazil, for instance, you have a quota of hiring 6% people with disabilities. In Italy, you have a quota. In France, you have a 5% quota. In Japan, you have a quota. In many places, you actually have fines. So there, it's clear cut. But what about the other parts of the world? We have a generations task force. And the piece that I want to get to is the race and ethnicity piece, because I don't honestly know, and we were talking about that earlier, I don't know of any company that's really doing this work well when it comes to race and ethnicity, including Sodexo. And I will tell you that if I use the language around race and ethnicity outside of the US, in many parts of Europe and other parts of the world, people will completely shut down. If I use the term minority outside of the US, people would shut down. And they will say, you're using your civil rights lens, you're bringing something that's so American to the rest of the world, you're exporting your own problems. These are things that you see, and I will never forget, and really quickly, I'll never forget, and tell me when you want me to stop, Stephanie, because I can keep going.
I was actually going to ask you this question, so it's helpful to me that you're already going there. Go ahead.
So I will never forget when I was on a panel, this was a Saturday morning, in Paris, a beautiful sunny day. And I was the only non-French speaker, and they had a bunch of professors and a bunch of government officials. And we were talking about, and this was really on the heels of Katrina and on the heels of the youth riots in Paris, on the outskirts of Paris. And the questions that went back and forth, and I'll never forget this sort of the accusation. So we had these French folks that were saying that the US media has basically hyped up the unrest of the youth of color in France, in Paris. This is just a CNN thing. And then sort of turning to me and saying, well, what about Katrina? What do you have to say about that? I sort of felt like I was defending my company and the country at that point in time. But the issue was, my response was, we're not perfect. We have issues, but we acknowledge those issues and we're trying to address it. I think in some, because you cannot count, so you don't know, what the representation of people of color is within a company, there is a certain amount of, I would say denial, but I think that looking at it from the French context or from the European context, it's more about, well, we're all French and we all have the same opportunities. So either if you're French, you have the same opportunities to succeed. We're egalitarian. So I'm not sure where I was going with that, but the way we addressed it outside of the US, the issues of race and ethnicity, we actually have a task force, a global task force, and we call it Cultures and Origins. Cultures and Origins is a euphemism for race, for underrepresented populations, for minorities. And in that task force, there are 4 strands. One is refugees. And refugees is a big issue in Europe. It's a big issue in Latin America with the Venezuelan refugees, in many parts of the world. So refugees is one. The second strand we have is religion, because when you talk about these strands, there's a lot of intersectionality. So religion intersects with people of color in many parts of the world, so we address issues of religion. The third issue we address is First Nations. Again, there's a lot of intersectionality because First Nations are minority populations in Australia, in Latin America, in Canada. You have First Nations, and that's the biggest minority. Aboriginal people, indigenous people are the biggest minorities. And the fourth stream that we have in this task force is local minorities. And the reason we call it local minorities is because we want to make sure that it is sort of contextualized to the laws and the cultures of the individual countries. So for us in the US, it is about Hispanics, it's about Asian Americans, it's about African Americans, it's about Native Americans. In other parts of the world, it's different. It's, what do they call it? In London, it is, why am I forgetting what it's called? But the BAME population. In other parts, it's the visible minorities. So we've contextualized it to the local context. So the global strategy is, it's challenging, it's not easy. You have to use different strategies. You have to contextualize it to the local context. And I will say that the biggest lesson that I learned was I have to take off my US lens and really put myself in the shoes of, can I share another story?
Yep, share another story. Yep.
So the story I have is, I grew up in India, and I came to the US to go to grad school. And when I went back to do work in India, I thought, I grew up there, I know the solutions. So we went and we were looking at, sort of mid-level women in Sodexo in India. And, here I had in my head, okay, we have to do network groups, we have to have mentoring, we have to have all of this.
Yeah.
And then I paused and I actually asked the women, these are entry-level women, I said, what is it that you need? How can we help you? Can anyone guess what the answer was? So they said that, we live in joint families. So in India, because, sort of partly because of obligations, partly because it's expensive in terms of, housing and all, so the couple lives with their in-laws. So we live in joint families. And if we work late in the office, we get chastised by a mother-in-law.
Wow.
And we have to go home and we have to do the housework and we have to cook for the entire family. Wow. So can you help us? And I'm thinking, yeah, right. How am I going to help you? But then they came up with a solution, which was, can you do a recognition event for us where you invite our extended families? It was awesome. It was so successful. So
they see how much good work they're doing in the company.
And
so
it changed the
marginalized.
dynamics that sometimes the mother-in-law would actually cook the dinner.
Wow.
And if they were late, they weren't, chastised. It was okay. So it really is taking off that lens, and I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and really putting yourself in the shoes of the other without judgment to help to then move them along. So
all right, so now I'm going to have you put the US lens on for a second, because I think one of the things that I learned when I started these interviews back in 2008 from you and your peers and other companies is how much fear there was that we were going to lose sight of issues of race and ethnicity as soon as we started talking about global diversity and inclusion. So I think you fast forward now 11, 12 years, and this is what many people feared would happen, right? I remember a lot of the same conversation I heard over and over again. We can only talk about gender because it's the only thing that resonates around the world. And what were the upsides and the downsides? Well, the downsides at that time, which I think many people would agree are happening now, is you magnify one issue so loud that it seems that the others don't matter, right? So I want to sort of capture this in the context of the case, because I think if there's any one question that I've been asked more times than not over the past 8 years is, Sodexo's journey started with issues of race, a racial discrimination lawsuit. So let's rewind back then and then help us to understand where you were then and how central is race and ethnicity to, even if it's your North American conversation right now. Did it disappear? Does it just look different? Since it was one of the reasons why you were hired, yes?
Yeah, so no, you're absolutely right. So just a couple of quick comments on that. So I have global responsibility for D&I, right? And one of the things that I have heard, I travel 80% of the time, and I actually lost a couple of team members in the US who were really seen as the go-to people by our communities of color and minority populations within Sodexo. Right. And so what I've heard is sometimes, this whole notion of cultures and origins, where does that leave issues of race? But having said that, we are very focused on issues of race, particularly in North America. We can't lose sight of it. And I was sharing earlier that so the first CEO in the case study is Michel Londel, and I take no credit whatsoever for his journey. He's an amazing human being, amazing. Yeah. But I will say every subsequent CEO after that, I will take a lot of credit for their journey, including Dick Macedonia, who you met and who is, But the most recent CEO that I report to is Denis Mechuel. He's a French man. And he would say to me, he's been in place for a year and a half, and he kept saying to me, he's based in Paris, why are we talking about cultures and origins and race and LGBT? We should just be focused on gender. Right. And I was, I struggled with, why there's too many things, why, and I was trying to talk about, equity, inclusion, all of these things. Right. And so what I ended up doing, this is partly speaking to how you bring leaders along and influence them. I invited him to an African American Leadership Forum meeting that we had in Dallas, Texas, that our African American Leadership Forum put together. It was an amazing event. It was earlier this year. Amazing event. Was at our client site, Southwest Airlines. They did a phenomenal job. The evening before, they had a beauty parlor and a barber shop where they had women of color and men of color talking about their experiences, and he attended the barber shop. He's a changed person.
Great.
I think he's never going to ask me again as to why we talk about issues of race in North America, why we're obsessed with it, because I think he heard firsthand some of the experiences and challenges.
Yeah.
So, the answer to your question is, the work is just not done. I think George says in the case study, right, it's not about the next sort of sexy new thing. It really is about where do you go from here? You start back at the beginning because there's more work to be done.
It's so interesting to me because I think you and I both know that diversity has increasingly become a hotter and hotter topic over the last few years. I think I certainly have not been doing this as long as you have, but I've spent my time over a decade contemplating the issues and interviewing leaders like yourself, and you've been doing this longer than that. And so I'm interested in your perspective on the new pushes, the new wave of interest into diversity and inclusion. Is this what we always hoped for? Is this energy misspent in the wrong direction? Is it just too many people hoping for a quick fix? What is your impression of this latest wave of energy over the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think there is this new energy around it, and I think folks are realizing that it needs to be sort of embedded within your business strategy, and that's what I was sharing with the group earlier.
Yeah.
You can't have diversity as a separate and apart thing. People have to get why it's good for your business. It has to be embedded within your business growth strategy. Right. And I can share in a minute about the business case that we did, because I think that's an important piece.
If you can also, there was one thing when I went to, we'll talk about your party later, but when I went to your party a couple weeks ago, somebody had talked about why you had said it's important to stress the business case. I will tell you that my class is very ambivalent about the business case. Yeah. And a lot of my friends and a lot of my fellow professors are ambivalent about this. So
I am too.
So share more.
We don't do a business case for why men are needed in an organization, right? So why do we need a business case for women within organizations? I mean, so that's sort of my personal view.
Yeah.
But having said that, I will say that you have to figure out a way to bring people along, whatever that way is. I don't think it's only the business case. I think that's one small piece of it. There are other things that are necessary to influence leaders. So if I can just share about this business case that we did. So we did this, we have now 5 years of data. We looked at data from 100 different entities, 50,000 managers globally, and we correlated what we see as gender balanced teams, or teams with 40 to 60% women, with our key performance indicators, and there were 5 of them: safety, client retention, employee engagement, and financial outcomes. And what we found was that teams with 40 to 60% women outperformed teams with less than 40% women. But when you get more than 60% women, the results plateau. So it's not about any one group being better than the other. You just need that optimal mix to be optimally successful. So that particular, so knowing our audience, and I had cited McKinsey data, I'd cited Credit Suisse, and Catalyst, etc. But this was Sodexo data.
Yeah.
And this helped to bring people along. So it really is about bringing people along. And I personally have a hard time about the business case.
Yeah.
But if I want to get people along, that's one thing you need. And the other thing is giving people those epiphanies that help to bring them along personally. So the example I shared about, with Denis Mechuel, Dick Macedonia was the other one. Did I share the example? I shared it earlier about the African American Leadership Forum talking about issues of race, where he sat in this conversation with the African American Leadership Forum, and they asked him questions, and he was angry and upset. He said, "How dare they ask me these questions?" This is the CEO. And then later on, he went into that room, and a week later, after some coaching, and he actually listened, and he didn't realize that people, and you say in the case study that individuals have different experiences based on who they are, and he heard a different perspective and said, help me understand. I haven't walked in your shoes. Change the dynamic. And he today, the only thing he does is being on diversity advisory boards. Yeah. So, the business case piece, I think it's a question of, bringing people along whichever way.
I think in meeting people where they are, right? So if you think
about,
exactly. There are many of us who enter into, I was talking about this with a group at lunch today, is many of us were artists in some form, right? We've got DJs, former dancers, creative writers. And we have at least one thing in common is we're all hanging out here at Penn and at the Wharton School, right? And you start to think about what are the things that you need to be able to accomplish if you're trying to get other people to see that the things that you're passionate around, music, art, and creative writing, are really important. It's finding a common language, right? And I think that's what the business case does, is there are people who do not necessarily understand the multitude of experiences that people have, and they can't be brought in from that place, would you say? And so giving them business language gives a common language for them to talk about?
I think you're absolutely right. It's a common language. And to me, look, it's absolutely critical that it's not just women and people of color talking about this.
Right.
We have to have white men as allies, discussing this, pushing the needle, being ambassadors. To me, that's what made the change at Sodexo. We had white males, and you heard them, at that event, right? The CEOs, the general counsel, who were pushing equally as hard as I did. And I stepped back because at the end of the day, my people get tired of hearing my voice. Yeah, of course she's going to talk about it.
Right.
We needed to have other individuals who were carrying these messages forward. So, I think, getting that, and the business case for Sodexo, so we talk about, every company says, we are a people business. It's about getting the best talent. Yes, it is. Every company says it's about understanding the customer. Yes, it is. It's about, having multicultural skills or competencies to manage multicultural teams. Yes, it is. But what made the difference at Sodexo, and you mentioned this in the case study, what made the difference was about 4 years into this journey. So you heard earlier in the introduction, at the time we had 120,000 employees at Sodexo in about 12 to 15,000 locations. And when I joined Sodexo, this is just in North America, I was really intimidated. How was we going to change the culture in an organization that was so geographically dispersed? What started to happen was our managers actually work out of our client site. So if Wharton is a client, our managers come to work here, our employees come to work here. And when we gave them the materials, when they were part of our Diversity and Inclusion Council, when we did trainings, we did it at the client site. The client would then participate sometimes, or the manager would share what they had learned with the client. All of a sudden, this manager who was interacting with a fairly junior person at the client location, now this, diversity and inclusion is a C-suite issue. So this manager's profile is elevated. All of a sudden, the manager is saying, hey, my client is interested. Can you come and speak to them? Last year, my team touched $1.2 billion worth of business.
That's amazing.
I mean, that is a real business case. So when our salespeople are going and making bids, they put in diversity and inclusion as a differentiator, as a competitive advantage. They come and ask us, hey, we're bidding on the business in Estee Lauder. Can you provide us with some context and access? And you know who I'm going to reach out to for that?
Yes.
So that's the business case. And I mean, and so white males who initially were saying, what's in it for me? This means you're taking away opportunities from me.
Right.
Today are not saying that.
That's fantastic.
Today are saying, look, if I can leverage diversity and inclusion to grow my business, it's going to mean more opportunities for me as well.
Right. So I have a quick story, and then I'm going to follow up on your top 3 tips for engaging white males as allies. I'm prompting you now.
Okay.
So funny story is in 2013 or 2014, I was in this city. I can't say all the details because it's my dissertation site. And I was walking around this hospital. And lo and behold, there's this big billboard picture of you, because you're actually coming, this is one of your clients, it turns out, you were coming to talk about diversity and inclusion that day. And it was amazing to me, first because I know you're everywhere, but it was one thing to actually just run into you in that capacity. But I also started to think about all the things that you've taught me about how important it is to show up and to be present and to continually speak to the different groups about why diversity and inclusion matters. So that was my side story, to give you enough time to think about your top three. I would say, in addition to what happened to race, right, when people read the case, that's sort of the top question people ask me. The second thing is so how exactly do you help people who are not just women and people of color, including white men, to feel like this is part of it? And I think you've talked about the business case for diversity is certainly something that draws attention for many who fall into that demographic. What else would you say?
Right, so I would say the business case, I think the data, and really tell a compelling story with the data.
Right.
Bringing in employee voices, because you can't deny that. But I think above everything else is meeting people where they are and shifting them.
Yeah.
So I mentioned Dick Macedonia,
Yeah.
I mentioned Denis Meshuel and the meeting in Dallas. The other example I'll give you is Philip Jansen, who was a CEO in Europe. And he was, again, on the sidelines, didn't want to be part of it, thought it was a waste of time. And so I knew, so this is about, understanding what makes people tick, what's in it for them. I knew he wanted to network with other CEOs. So I got him involved in a cross-company mentoring program in Europe. So he met with other CEOs. Right. He mentored a woman in a different organization. This woman happened to get laid off. He came to me and he said, this is unacceptable. How is it that women have to go through these kinds of experiences? And again, for the first time, he actually heard it from a woman's perspective.
Yeah.
He came to me and he said, I want every one of my 12 direct reports to mentor a woman from a different country.
Yeah.
Today, 10 of those 12 women have senior level positions. They're either CEO of countries or big chunks of business. And one of the men who mentored a woman who was leading a high security facility in the UK came to me afterwards and said, if you had put two candidates in front of me, a man and a woman, and said, hire the best qualified candidate to lead a high security facility, I would have chosen the man. You need an assertive, aggressive style. It's a dangerous, environment. He said, after mentoring Janine, who has a very different leadership style, very low key, but extremely effective and successful, I will never let that unconscious bias come into play again. Today, Janine heads our business in all of, Europe. So to me, it's a combination. It really is about essentially meeting people where they are, understanding what makes them tick, and then moving them along using business case, data, employee voices, personal experiences to get them to where you want them to be.
So I think it's pretty fascinating, I will say. So Rohini had I'm not allowed to call it what I want to call it, a rewiring party.
Right,
she is not going to be in her position any longer come, I think your last day is someday soon, yes?
Yeah, middle of January.
So she's moving on into other places, including maybe vacation. So I'm going to
come to you and ask you about book ideas.
She's trying to get me to do more work. Like, I don't have enough work to do, but that's okay. That's okay. We've been at this for a while, so I'm sure we can make it work. But I think one of the things that was fascinating to me was, so George Chevelle and Dick Macedonia were there on the stage, just well, everybody was absolutely gushing about the 17 years that you've spent at this company and the amazing things that you've done. I remember interviewing half of these people 11 years ago, and they were not as optimistic about how this was going to work, right? And not that I want to depress you all in saying that it takes, 17 years for culture change, but it certainly takes a long time for them to sing your praises and the work that you've done. And what they said was all of their stories about how you enabled them or empowered them to take charge, right? It didn't have to be your face that was seen. Can you talk a little bit about, I know there was a strategy there. I know this wasn't random, but can you talk a little bit about that strategy around helping them to be the face of diversity?
So I think so often what happens is when you have a person as a chief diversity officer, I think sometimes, that person becomes the face of internally and externally. And I think that's great, but at the same time, I think it takes away from the empowerment piece that you raise. And I think you have to have, you have to be able to empower others within the organization to carry the messages forward. I will say that today, I don't have to be in any executive team room for this topic to come up and be discussed. It doesn't have to be my voice. So I think you really do have to enable others. And it was a strategy, particularly when I started doing the work in Europe. And you sort of mentioned it in the case study. I struggled, I was, I think you have a quote there, right? So what I said to you at the time when you were interviewing me was, when I'm in Europe and people interact with me, they see me as Indian, and they share all kinds of things, global stuff, US stuff, etc. The moment I start talking about diversity and inclusion, they switch. And they see me as American, and they completely shut down. So knowing that, I knew that I couldn't, take my sort of US success stories, and there were many. We had done this well for several years before launching it globally. And I struggled with, who do I have, in Europe to carry this forward? And I finally hired Jean-Michel Monod. He's no longer with the company, but I hired him, French, straight, white man. The best thing I did, because he was heard in a very different way than I was. So I think it is about empowering others, giving people the tools, allowing them to carry the messages forward, because that's the only way it can become institutionalized and systemically embedded within the organization.
I do want to say one thing that you're not saying is that you weren't valuable, because I think sometimes when people hear that, they say, well, all we need are straight white men talk about diversity. But the reality is the engine behind that strategy was a woman of color who had deep expertise in subject matter. And I was still
very much the face of. It's not that I wasn't, internally and externally, but there were many people who were helping ambassadors to carry this message forward, clearly. I'm with Jean-Michel. He knew zero about diversity and inclusion. So it was really helping him to kind of navigate.
And so I think for me, the reason why I wanted to make sure that was said is because recently, it was about a year ago, I was in New York City in like a closed door meeting with a bunch of high-level chief human resources officers. And it was so different. There were 2 women and like 8 men in this room, which is not typically who we see as the face of diversity. And they were the face of HR. Right. And there was only maybe like 2 people of color in the room. So it was mostly white faces, and most of them were men in CHRO roles. And I remember this woman sitting there, and she's been CHRO over company for years, and she says, I just feel, I want to feel happy, because I know what we've been saying for so long is women and people of color shouldn't have to do all the work, but something is, I feel sad about the fact that it doesn't seem like people cared until white men started talking about it. Have you heard your peers talking about this? And if that's sort of the ethos that's in the air, is it something that people should be concerned with, or should they just move on?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point that you raise. So on the one hand, you want to have, white men involved in this work. Clearly, you need to have, because this is about all of us, right? It's not us versus them. And, at the cost of being sort of, so I will extend this one step further. So even when you talk about people of color, very often it's just African Americans who are in the D&I space. And I struggle with that as well. And if you think about it, the CEO hired me, an Asian American, at the time when there was a lawsuit filed by African Americans. And that was a huge risk that the company took, a huge risk. I knew that from that first moment, the first thing that I had to do was to build my trust with the African American community within Sodexo. And to be honest, for the longest time, and I haven't shared this in, public forums before, for the longest time, I actually distanced myself from the Asian ERG, because I felt I had to be sort of above and I had to be completely unbiased and unattached to any one group so that I could be, there for everyone. So I really removed myself from that nexus, although, I identified as an Asian American, with so I think it's a difficult conversation. On the one hand, I do think, I don't think it's an either or. I mean, I actually think we can have, white men and should have white men involved. But I think at the end of the day, it has to be also about people of color, because this work is very personal. And it is, women, people of color who've had those personal experiences. I think it's wonderful when you have white men who acknowledge their privilege and use that to the benefit of others. So I think it's a both and. I don't know any other way of sort of talking about it.
All right, I think I have a couple minutes left before we open up for question, or 1 minute. Looking back, 17 years, anything you would have done differently?
Yeah, I actually shared this with the group earlier. I think the one thing, so in the case study, you talk about the scorecard and the metrics that we had, and because we had this lawsuit and we wanted to do something pretty quickly, we actually put in place a scorecard, which basically looked at primarily quantitative metrics and outcomes. So it was more about recruiting, retention, promotion for women and people of color. And we had those hard metrics. That caused a fair amount of backlash. And I think if I had to do it again, I would have done what we now do, which is to have, it's based on a point scoring system, so on 1,000 points, we have 600 points in recruiting, retention, and promotion, and 400 on inclusive actions.
Okay, great.
So the inclusive actions are very clearly spelled out, what we see as inclusive actions. And so we give people credit for actually
Can you give some examples of some of those inclusive actions?
So there are things like mentoring someone different from yourself, being a sponsor to someone different from yourself, ensuring that you have trainings at certain meetings, ensuring that you're involved in the community, making sure that you're developing and advancing high potential women and people of color. So these are all the things that lead to the recruiting, retention, and promotion of women and minorities.
Not just the outcome,
not
but the
just the outcome, the
processes,
the actions that get to the outcomes. So I think that would have, sort of reduced the amount of backlash. It certainly got attention, but would have reduced the backlash. I think that's one. I think the second thing I would have done is to put in place sort of metrics and accountability earlier in the global work. Michelle put it in place, I think it was in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 2016. I think we should have done that a little earlier, only because he retired in 2018, and now they've gotten rid of it. And I wish, we could have put that in place earlier. So those are the two things that I think, I'm not sure what else I can think of. Anything?
I'm not going to judge. I'm the last person to judge.
You.
But my students might. So who has a question? Anybody have questions? Who has the mics? So Kate has one and Timka has the other. So we'll have a chance for some questions for the audience. I can keep going as well, but
and you guys had some great questions of the session before, so please
we can revisit some of those as well.
Or expand, whatever you'd like to do.
Okay, so while they're thinking about their questions, advice. So here's what's interesting. As we've had lots of interest now in diversity strategies from more companies around the world, I've also seen in my time here at Wharton, which has just been since 2017, a lot of students are interested in doing diversity work in their companies. Many in a role like yours someday, others as their side jobs, as they're doing other work. So if they want to gain, now I believe you were a consultant before you took the job. Yeah. Okay, so what types of skills do you think they should be cultivating if they want to either do it, and I'm sure it's different, as a addendum to their core work, or as part of a role, a D&I role?
Sure. So just bring me back if I tend to wander, because as you asked this question, I remember that you'd asked a question about sort of the trend for a lot of companies.
Sure.
So my recommendation would be those that are thinking of a D&I role in an organization, make sure that you see it as a solid, substantive role and not just a figurehead. Mm-hmm. There are many, many companies that have this role as a figurehead, and you don't want to go there. So ask the right questions, see where it reports into, make sure that there's commitment and resources behind it, make sure that the CEOs...
Into?
I won't make a statement and sort of unilateral statement on that. I report to the CEO. After I rewire and exit from Sodexo, it's going to report into HR.
Right.
So to me, it depends on the sort of stage of the journey.
Right.
So I think if you're reporting to the CEO and you're a figurehead, what's the point, right? If the CEO has no time to meet with you or talk to you about this, what's the point?
Right.
So I think it needs a little bit more unpacking in terms of what's the most effective reporting in the context of that organization. But in terms of skills, I would say the number one skill in my mind is sort of strategic leadership and influencing. And my background as a consultant, I think one of the things that I had sort of practiced and honed was going into a situation in an organization, very quickly assessing the situation, figuring out what the pain points are, and then figuring out the strategies to move the individual along. But all of that required you to understand the business very well, because it had to be within the context of that particular business. So I would say strategic leadership. I would say influencing. I would say understanding the core business extremely well. I think those are some key skill sets, in addition to the ability to partner and to build relationships, because at the end of the day, this is about people trusting you. Right. And being authentic. I mean, I think you just have to be authentic. You can't, be false about this, because it just doesn't work. Yeah. You have to be transparent and authentic. So I would say those are some of the key things.
Okay. Questions from the audience?
Okay, I see a hand up. Yes, there you go. And keep going, folks. I'm sure you have questions, either about the case study or just for me.
Hey, thanks again for making it out. And I was part of that group earlier, so since you welcomed the questions, here I am.
Sure.
With that, you mentioned earlier that you don't know of an organization, including your own, that is doing a great job as it relates to race and ethnicity.
Right.
And I think that you can't solve a problem unless you kind of understand the root causes of it. And my curiosity is, what do you think are the impediments that are driving organizations to be ineffective in this space?
So I think, that's a good question, and I would say not effective at it outside the US. I think there are plenty of companies that are doing a really good job, including ours, within the US. Now, there's always room for improvement, but I think there are companies that are doing it well within the US. Outside of the US, it's a couple of things. One is it's issues of data and data privacy and not being able to gather the data. The second is not being able to translate issues of race, ethnicity, and minorities in different countries. And what does that mean in India, right, when everybody is Indian? There you talk about issues of caste, you talk about issues of language, you talk about issues of religion. So I think that's the nuance that you have to understand. And very often with our history in this country, and because D&I work has basically been sort of something that has emerged out of the work in the US, we kind of look at it with a civil rights mindset, and it doesn't translate, it doesn't work. And that's where, so I work for a French company. They do not understand what you mean by issues of race. So I have to go at it in a different way. When you go to Brazil, you talk about issues of race, and we know that there's a large population of Black Brazilians that are disempowered in Brazil. But you have to be able to talk about it in a way, and this is not about minimizing the issue. It really is about getting an access point, getting an entry point, whatever way you can to address it. It doesn't matter at the end of the day whether you're calling it race or ethnicity or whatever, so long as you're addressing the issue. And I honestly don't know an organization that has necessarily done it effectively globally. There are pockets. We're doing a decent job in the UK. We're doing a decent job in Australia, but there we're talking about the Aboriginal population. but how do you sort of start unpacking and addressing this? Now, so in parts of Europe, the way we're approaching it is through this language around refugees, because there's a large percentage of refugees in many European countries, Germany, France, etc. But what about the local population in France that is second and third generation French, that are black from Africa, right? They're not included in when we talk about refugees. So you have to be able to, approach it in a way that people can get their arms around it and accept it. It's not easy. I don't have any other solution than, just to sort of try these strategies.
Question over here? Yes.
Thank you for speaking with us and sharing your insight. In hearing some of your answers, it's very clear that data plays an important role in communicating the impact of what programs and initiatives you guys have launched. My question is, what role does data actually play in designing these programs? And especially when you're talking about something like diversity and inclusion, those aren't so easy to measure. So maybe do you have some insight on how you measure those things?
Yeah, so data plays a huge, huge role. To me, the starting point is actually data. So when we look at, what initiatives to design, it is looking at the data, seeing where the pain points are, figuring out what you're solving for. So, we went from sort of general kind of initiatives to figuring out that where we had the blockages were in mid-level managers for women and people of color, particularly for women and people of color in P&L and operational roles. So what we did was we took our mentoring, sponsorship, leadership development programs and really honed it at that level. And then we were able to put in place metrics. So what are the percentages of these individuals being promoted after they've gone through these programs versus their cohort population? So that's how we basically measure it. Now, the ultimate measure for us is our scorecard, which is recruiting, retention, promotion, as I mentioned. But for each one of our initiatives, we actually measure. We have ERGs, and oftentimes it's difficult to measure the impact of ERGs. We actually have a special survey. You all know what ERGs are, right? Employee resource groups or business resource groups. So there's African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, women's groups, etc. So we actually have a survey that we send out where we look at, retention, productivity, engagement for this group that belongs to these ERGs versus, again, the cohort population. And then we also look at, the engagement survey that we have that we conduct every other year to look at and we have an inclusion index from that. So we look at, what is, and I will say that when we had the lawsuit and, one of the things that we did the survey in 2002, 2004, 2006, and I would say probably around 2006 it started changing. But we literally buried the results.
Yeah.
Because, when we looked at the results for women and minorities within Sodexo compared to white men, it was like they were working in two different planets.
Yeah.
Because the experiences were so different. Now I'm just really proud to say that, it's sort of on par, and there's some groups that have even exceeded. So it's changed, the culture has changed. So there are ways to measure. They're not, but I would say each one of our initiatives we try to have, when we think about the initiative, we think about what is the pain point, why are we doing it, and then how are we going to measure success. Does that help?
I think we can grab another question.
Thank you for coming once again. I was really interested by how you're talking about allyship in terms of the roles that white men can play, and I was wondering if you could speak more about specific actions that people who are just in a more advantaged or more privileged positions can take in general. So for example, when it comes to like women's issues, like white women have greater positions of privilege than women of color, and like how they can be effective allies and roles, or like when it comes to like East Asians, like they're a lot more privileged than Southeast Asians. So I'm wondering just like if you can speak on how they can
So I think, I wouldn't make blanket statements like that. I mean, I think you're right, and I'll get to the sort of answer, but I would say privilege is contextual. So I grew up in India, right? And growing up in India, I was not really conscious of my privilege because everyone else looked like me. I belonged to the majority religion. I was educated, but I didn't have that consciousness of my privilege because I was surrounded by others very much like me till I came to the US and was a minority. And that was the first time that I really started understanding the privileges that I had had because I now experienced a lack of privilege. And I started understanding the lack of privilege that others have, minorities in the United States. So that's sort of the contextual piece. And I would say that one of the things that we struggled with very often is that when you talk about gender, right? Oftentimes you see sort of everyone as a monolith and not understand and not necessarily unpack the intersectionality of identities within gender as well. So you may have white women who have privilege, but basically because they have not been put in this situation and have not had their awareness raised, don't quite understand the lack of privilege that other women might have. So you sort of see it as sort of, I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, but sort of equivalent, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I'll give you, Perry Bridger, who's mentioned in this case study, she was a very strong supporter, very much of an advocate for women's issues, but did not understand the issues of women of color and how the experiences of women of color were different till she went to this one session that Working Mother Media did where they had these breakouts and she heard some of the, how women of color experience their life and their work. And that was sort of the awareness that was raised for her. Now, going to your second part of your question, what can they do? What she ended up doing was she became a really strong supporter of women of color. Her successor, Jerry Hall, who's now my successor, actually, Perry was the one who sponsored her. So it really is about, honestly, we all have privilege. I have a lot of privilege, and I need to recognize that. I have able-bodied privilege, and I talk about, I will never forget the first time when I did a session for a group of individuals who were 60 people who were not sighted. And I asked a question, and in that room of 60 people, 20 people raised their hands. For the first time, I'm thinking, how the heck do I call on one person to speak?
Right.
I'm the only sighted person in the room. They don't know that there are 20 other people whose hands are raised. I can't point and say you. I can't say you in the blue dress. I mean, how do I call on them?
Right.
It's all of us. It's not just that it's white males who have privilege or white females who have privilege. I think we all need to understand that we all have privilege in some dimension of our identity. We need to recognize that, and we need to stop feeling guilty about it. We need to be able to use that to make this a better place. We need this in this country. I mean, so the example I gave you of Perry Bridger, as a white woman, she used that in order to really work with, understand the issues, and benefit us. Does that sort of help or answer your question? Were you looking for something more?
Yeah, that helps in terms of like the general
Yeah.
to take. I guess I was also wondering if you have specific like actions, like examples of like what to do exactly.
What
Right.
did Perry do?
Yeah,
Did she-
so I think
yeah.
Perry, so I think first was self-awareness, right? Being self-aware. And the second was then, using that self-awareness to speak up. So, men, not just white men, I'm talking about any men. When you see something, say something, right? You see women being shut down in a meeting. Who is it that was recently telling me that, this happens regularly. So, you have a meeting, and if it's a predominantly masculine culture, a woman says something, you immediately have someone following that, and a man saying something, and it's, suddenly it becomes the most brilliant idea. Now, the man can feed into it, right? Or can step back and say, I was just amplifying what I just heard a minute ago. So it's those kinds of things, using that, or interrupting things that are inappropriate, or jokes, because very often, we laugh. If I'm a straight person and if there's a joke being made about sexual orientation or someone's sexual orientation, I keep quiet, or I feed into it by laughing. I mean, as a straight person, I need to use, my privilege and be an ally and interrupt that and stop that. So that's at a micro level. On a macro level, depending on where you are in the organization, it's putting in place those systems and structures to ensure and enable the progression and success of everyone within the organization.
So Rohini, I could keep you longer, but I won't. But I do want to show you this.
Oh, this is, so you took some pictures, or this is?
Her non-retirement, because I'm not allowed to call it. So Rohini sends me this email. I hadn't seen Rohini in a long time, but every time I move a different place, over the past 11 years, I email her and say, I'm now here,
right.
I'm now here. So we've connected over email, but I hadn't seen her until this April. And so I was so excited to reconnect. I was thinking about all the wonderful things we could do. And then I swear, a few months later, you send me this note saying that you are moving on to other things. And I was so sad. But this party that I went to made me especially optimistic, because you talked about this as diversity 2.0 and where we're headed in the future. And I think being there with your company and all these people who I'd met years ago who allowed me to be invasive and ask all these questions about what you did and the hard things, I think it gives me a lot of hope that other people will be able to learn, but also to be able to grow beyond. So I am so grateful to you. Timka has something for you from me to just say thank you so much for, I think, every day somebody says we need more diversity cases. I said, you don't know how hard it was to get that one. So I think for just trusting me all those years ago to tell this story, and I think for allowing so many of us to learn. I think the Diversity Inc. Awards and everything you've gotten is so well deserved, because I think you've been so generous with your time. And you've allowed yourselves to be seen, I think, for all the pain points, but also all the wins. So just a little gift from me to you, to say thank you. Thank you for coming and sharing with me. Oh, they're going to do amazing things. So good night. Thank you all for being here to the TA's events. And I will see everybody in class on Wednesday.